The Brussels Report podcast.
Welcome at the new episode of the Brussels Report podcast. My name is Pieter Cleppe, and I'm delighted to have with me as my guest today Dalibor Rohac, who is from Slovakia originally, but has been based in the United States in Washington, D.C. for a very long time. He is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a leading free market conservative think tank in DC. But he's also a research associate here in Brussels at the Martens Centre, linked to the EPP, and also a senior research fellow at the University of Buckingham in the United Kingdom, which is the first private university in the UK. So welcome, Dalibor.
Great to be with you, Peter.
Great. So you recently wrote a comment on Brussels Report where you presented your new book, which is really interesting. It's called "Governing the European Union in the Age of Division," and you were, I thought, making an interesting point that whether you're a skeptic or more, let's say, EU federalist, at the end of the day, the strength of the EU is the diversity, in the sense that sometimes countries prefer to cooperate more closely. Sometimes they are, let's say, less keen to do that, and at the end of the day, that's just fine. It actually works relatively well. Is that a good summary of your book?
It is a good summary, I would say, and maybe I should preface all of this by saying that as an Eastern European, obviously I've been throughout my adult life a friend and advocate for the European project. I mean, I have seen the enormous amount of economic and social and political progress that joining the EU and the prospect of joining the EU has brought to Central and Eastern Europe. I don't think you would have the sort of success stories that you see in Poland, in Slovakia, in the Baltic states without EU membership. What prompted me to write the book was this sort of question of whether the project itself has reached sort of a dead end or not, whether the past 15 years can be considered a success or not. And I suppose the argument that I'm making in the book is that the answer is really in the eye of the beholder. If you think that the EU is meant to be a platform for ever greater social progress and ever deeper integration and ever sort of deeper unification of the European continent, then very clearly the past 15 years have not been a success for the EU, in the sense that in spite of all these crises that have hit Europe, like those have not served as an impetus for creating a European federal superstate, as some self-styled Euro-federalists had once hoped. But what I say in the book is that perhaps that's not the best metaphor for understanding what the EU is about. It should not be a sort of one-way conveyor belt towards some promised land, towards a qualitatively new form of governance. Maybe the EU should be just understood as a way of organizing, relationships between nation states of Europe, a way of managing diversity, managing disagreement, managing the sort of pluralism that has always characterized the European continent. And from that perspective, the EU is doing just fine. Its architecture is necessarily flawed in various respects, imperfect, but as long as it provides some vital European public goods, most notably the four freedoms, perhaps we should dial down the catastrophism that characterizes debates about various policy challenges facing Europe. So it is a call for perhaps less catastrophism, less ambition in a sense in the context of European debates, and it's also to some extent a sort of normative program of how we should sort of think about European integration going forward, which I'm happy to sort of discuss in greater detail.
Yeah, I think your perspective is definitely interesting, and I personally I agree with a lot of that, especially with the idea that we should not be too alarmist. At the end of the day, there is the single market. I mean, there is this platform for, let's say, consultation, for coordination between European democracies, and that's great. At the end of the day, despite all the flaws that the European Union has, and of course, as having worked for so long for a British think tank, I always guess I looked a little bit more critical at the EU. Um, but I must say, there's maybe one thing that since the United Kingdom has left, I do think that maybe in Brussels not everybody will agree, but that sort of the adults have left the room, and a number of sort of things that would not be so easy to pull through, like for example this jointly financed debt fund, the recovery fund of the EU, the RRF, but also a number of other things, specifically when it comes to Ukraine. Maybe that's more controversial. The EU using its peace facility for weapon deliveries to Ukraine. As much as I'm sympathetic to helping Ukraine, I'm a little wary of doing that at the EU level. So I sort of also maybe the way that disputes are being fought out between East and West, and maybe North and South. It's sort of my hunch that I don't know, like the European Commission bureaucracy, especially Ms. von der Leyen with the Green Deal, they're sort of unrestrained. There's no longer the Brits that say no to anything remotely resembling EU federalism. So my impression is that their idea is, oh, let's just go for it, and then sometimes they actually get somewhere, like in the case of the recovery fund. And I'm not convinced that this enjoys sufficient support in mainland Europe, and I'm a little afraid that at some point we'll see some blowback. So what's your idea on this?
I think that's broadly speaking right. I mean, I wasn't thrilled by the UK's departure from the EU, both for the sake of the UK itself and for the sake of the EU, because I did think that the Brits played a largely constructive role and were a useful counterweight to the voices calling for more heavy-handed approaches towards federalism. But perhaps where I would depart from your analysis is in thinking that this push for deeper federalization remains very controversial across European countries. It remains a non-starter in much of the EU's east. You still have a cohort of countries that are not very keen to join the eurozone, for example. When you think about the resilience and recovery facility and the sort of common debt that is funding a part of it, like even that was a massive, so required a massive political pull to to get it going. And it's going to be an interesting question, obviously. Like if you have more governments getting into trouble in sort of fiscal terms going forward, whether that sort of mechanism and the pooling of debt might provide a sort of politically feasible solution. My hunch in that respect is that it's going to be at least as controversial as the earlier bailouts that we saw a decade or so ago. So I'm not terribly worried. When you think about an area like foreign policy, for example, where on sort of pure externality grounds, you can make a strong case for the EU being a sort of unified actor and speaking with one voice on the global stage. And people have been talking about strategic autonomy for years. Well, I don't think that's happening either, in spite of the fact that the EU and Western allies have proved to be, fairly united and energetic in responding to the Russian aggression. It also is the case that there has been a significant erosion of trust of countries that between countries in the EU, and the idea that now we'll sort of emerge out of this war with qualified majority rule governing foreign policy, like that strikes me as really utopian. And when you look at it from the perspective of, say, Poland, the idea that now they should sort of say yes to a new system of decision making in which they would be outvoted by the French and the Germans, who were consistently wrong about Russia. Like that doesn't strike me as a very appealing
Mm.
political proposition in a place like Poland. Uh, so I just don't see, in spite of there are many sort of interesting sort of threads in what you said, which we could sort of try pulling, including this drift towards protectionism and industrial policy and so on and so forth. But I mean, I just don't see the sort of fundamental characteristic of the EU, which is to say that it's fairly divided and very heterogeneous when it comes to various areas of public policy. I don't see that fundamental fact changing anytime soon.
Mm. Okay, and perhaps to pick your brains on um, the increasing interest rates, which are of course posing big problems across the globe. I mean, personally, I always like higher interest rates, especially when they have been so artificially low for so long. But of course, politically, this is far from easy. And specifically in the eurozone, where you have a number of countries, including my own country, Belgium, but of course also France, all the southern European countries that are burdening very high debt levels. I mean, do you expect any crisis, any euro crisis, to re-emerge as a result of this development?
Look, I was trained as an economist, but I don't really sort of practice macroeconomic forecasting for a living. So I'm not sure I should sort of venture and offer sort of predictions about what's going to happen. But uh, from sort of where I sit, I think there are like warning lights that are on, which are not insignificant. Whether it's the high rates of inflation and the high levels of government debt, the combination of the two should make one wary. A decade ago, central banks around the world, not just the ECB but other central banks as well, have decided that the best way to ease the pressure of financial markets on governments and to sort of stimulate the economy emerging out of the Great Recession of 2008 was to go on and purchase large amounts of government debt. We can think whatever we want about those policies, but clearly those policies were sustainable in a low inflation environment. And right now, if you have a situation where central banks, for the sake of their own credibility, have to start bringing inflation down, they just don't have the same sort of leeway to
Mm.
help governments, uh, lower their borrowing costs. And I think the risk of this leading to some sort of fiscal crisis in one or several eurozone countries, like that risk is, I think, to my mind, fairly elevated. Like we already, we live in a low growth environment. We have this inflation problem. Um, Debt levels are high. Uh, I mean, I suspect that we will reach a point over the next year or so where where sort of borrowing costs facing different governments will go up to a point where they will either have to go to the IMF or to the European Stability Mechanism, or something will have to be worked out to keep those governments afloat, and just sort of ECB buying bonds will no longer be an option. And the question is how that plays out, because it looks like the ECB did actually play a big role in keeping borrowing costs low, especially on the Eurozone's periphery over the past decade.
Hmm. Actually, that brings me to something else I want to discuss with you. So, about I think 12 years ago, when American President Obama when he was engaged in what he then called his pivot to Asia, meaning devoting more attention to Asia than to Europe, to old Europe. Um, he sort of suddenly had to send his finance minister, his treasury secretary, Timmy Geithner, to Berlin, to Germany, because the American banks were in trouble because they had been lending too much to a number of European economies. So, sort of, his pivot to Asia was corrected by political gravity, you could say. And you've been, for I think a very long time, been based in DC, been working in DC politics, and it would be interesting to hear, as a European. Do you feel that the United States, that the, sort of the political machine is turning away from Europe, as many people have claimed, also referring to Trump threatening not to defend the Baltics, for example? We can give many examples. Or is this all a little bit overblown? I mean, have we always seen episodes of the U.S. sort of, let's say, uh, communicating some reality talk to the Europeans, or is there something more at play? Maybe demographics, the fact that the United States has become more diverse, has become less European, so to speak, and that it's only normal, or maybe because of globalization, that it's only normal that they turn more attention to the rest of the world. So what's your idea of this?
That's a fascinating question. I'm not sure I have a sort of clear cut answer. You see this pattern throughout, the presidencies of Barack Obama, of Donald Trump, and also through the presidency of Joe Biden, that these people come to the office with a sort of promise of sort of breaking with the status quo to some extent, right? And that means that was Obama's pivot to Asia, him declaring himself the first Pacific president in the history of the US. That was 2009, and you had the similar thing with Trump and his sort of focus on China as the major sort of geopolitical rival of the United States. And obviously that sort of continued to a large extent into the Biden presidency. But what happens at the same time is that events interfere, right, with the sort of grand designs that politicians and political leaders have. So in Obama's case, it was obviously the turmoil in Syria and the rise of the so-called Islamic State and the annexation of Crimea that sort of changed the conversation. Throughout the Trump presidency, Afghanistan dragged on. There was questions about Iran, and in Biden's case, where it really looked like for a while that, in spite of all the talk about America's being back, the United States were now being focused quite sort of exclusively on the Indo-Pacific and China. Then you had the events interfere again, and with the breakout of the war, the United States obviously is preoccupied with what's happening in Ukraine to an extent that I think few people in the administration predicted or wished for just a year ago. So I suppose the lesson from that is that Europeans have to take seriously the fact that there is this sort of thirst and interest in the United States for sort of dealing with the problems of the Indo-Pacific. We should not take it for granted in Europe that the Americans will always be there. But at the same time, I mean, the US is a global superpower. Global superpowers have to be able to focus on more than one thing at a time, which is proven very difficult. But I mean, if the US wants to remain a global superpower, it will have to, be able to both keep NATO relevant and keep Europe secure, help keep Europe secure, including by, urging Europeans to sort of step up and take their own defenses more seriously, and also be able to, deal with geopolitical problems emerging in other theaters, whether it be the Indo-Pacific or the Middle East. And obviously, successive administrations have done a sort of mixed job on those various fronts.
And it's all interlinked. I saw that the Biden administration is now sort of, like, let's say, getting closer again to Caracas, to Venezuela, which of course has everything to do with also the Russians' aggression of Ukraine, because this
Yeah.
has also this has put the energy shortages.
Well,
Uh,
that's the thing about these pivots. So I think some people sort of argue that some people who, particularly coming from the sort of realist tradition of international relations, they point out, not incorrectly, that the resources are limited, our attention spans are limited. We have to pick our priorities. We can't be everywhere at once, and to some extent that's fair enough. But at the same time, like what happens in Ukraine, say, has repercussions elsewhere. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the heightened interest in the security of Taiwan and the debates about what would happen should the Chinese, go for a full-fledged invasion of Taiwan, like those debates have emerged in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I suspect the leadership in Beijing is watching very closely what's happening in Ukraine and how much stamina the West has, because that's informative for what would likely happen should the Chinese take over take over Taiwan. Similarly, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was motivated by the sense that it's a country that doesn't really matter all that much to the United States, and why are we there? And we had been there for 20 years and accomplished nothing. Well, to me, it makes intuitive sense that withdrawal was a signal to people around the world, including to Vladimir Putin, that the United States, in a way, lacks the determination and stamina to be the world's policeman, so to speak, and that might have encouraged somebody like Putin to pull off this sort of attempted invasion of Ukraine. So these things, as you say, are very much interlinked. The Middle East is part of the picture as well, and the sort of Saudi-US relationship, which has been very sort of turbulent over the past 2 years. So I think we have to sort of break out from this sort of mindset in which we can sort of easily compartmentalize these different sort of aspects of foreign policy, and that's a massive challenge for the United States, which obviously is a global superpower, but at the same time its sort of share of global output and its sort of soft power is probably smaller than it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago.
You think so? Because of the let's say, maybe less cultural exports, or
Um, So when it comes to sort of economic indicators, I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say that the sort of share of the industrialized West, and especially of the United States, has declined over time.
true.
When it comes to soft power, well, I am worried a lot about the inward turn that you see both in the United States and in the European Union, and also exemplified by things like the UK's departure from the EU, which just makes the West collectively and our individual sort of trading blocks just less apt at sort of leveraging the size of our markets as a geopolitical tool, right? Like, gone is the time when the US was sort of striking trade deals around the world and bringing the fence sitters on board in various international negotiations. I mean, the US right now has no trade policy. I mean, it's a very, very sad thing to say. The EU has somewhat of a trade policy, but far less ambitious than even sort of 5 years ago. And actually, one of the surprising things, or perhaps not so surprising things about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that in spite of all the talk of the unity of the West, which has been real, and applaud that unity, you have an awful lot of fence sitters around the world. The Indonesias and Argentinas, and essentially the whole of Latin America, whole of Sub-Saharan Africa, India, that are trying to stay as far away from the conflict as possible, and you have to wonder whether that's not in part a result of a very passive and unambitious approach to say trade relations and economic liberalization, that there aren't very many carrots that the EU or the United States are offering to these countries in exchange for cooperation on sort of geopolitical matters.
Interesting, yeah. Okay, I want to go to the last topic, which is basically to discuss your home region, Central and Eastern Europe, to the extent that we can define that as a region. That's always up for interpretation, of course. I remember when I was in Croatia, there was a Croatian politician who said, we fought so hard for independence, and then when we finally got it, everybody left. So there's some frustration, and I thought he summed it up in a brilliant way. Across the region of Central and Eastern Europe, where so many good young people have left, and I mean, of course, you can't blame them for it. Globalization is offering enormous chances. But is this sort of linked to the criticism that often is being exercised on countries like Hungary, where perhaps an older electorate votes for more authoritarian-leaning politicians, or is that analysis nonsensical? Are different things at play? To what extent is the criticism on Central and Eastern European member states of the EU justified when it comes to the claims that they are sort of undermining the rule of law and basically embracing illiberal democracy, arguments like that? Of course, we can also see that they are typically quite realist when it comes to defending themselves. I think that's not up for interpretation that here Western Europe has lost the plot and is thankfully, I think, turned the corner finally, and is now realizing how irresponsible they were. But when it comes to sort of indeed rule of law, you hear this arguments coming back all the time. And yeah, what is your idea on this?
That's again like a fascinating sort of series of questions that I'll try to sort of tackle. Probably only in a very sort of in sort of not in a comprehensive way. So first of all, I don't necessarily share that sort of sense of pessimism about transitions and joining the EU that is displayed in writings of, say, Ivan Krastev and Stefan Holmes, in their famous book, The God That Failed. I do think that Central and Eastern Europe as a whole is, as prosperous, as peaceful, as democratic as it has ever been. Notwithstanding the brain drain, yes, there has been brain drain, very significant in the case of countries like Latvia or Poland, where especially after 2008, you had lots of young people, especially educated young people, leave for in search of economic opportunities elsewhere. At the same time, it's true that how do I put it? Look, you had massive sort of economic adjustments after 2008 in say the Baltic countries, and sort of the idea that it was having preferable for these people to sort of stay and sort of enjoy.
Sure.
In quotation marks, 30% youth unemployment or something like that, just doesn't strike me as very convincing. And there has been brain drain, but there has been also sort of immigration back from other countries. Like, people go and study in the UK, work in the UK for a while, they come back. Not all of them. Some build their lives elsewhere, but I don't think it's a sort of one-way street. And as sort of income levels slowly converge, and as quality of life and public services slowly converges. You see that in places like the Baltic states or the Czech Republic. I don't think living in those countries remains as unattractive a proposition as it was 15 or 20 years ago. So I don't share that sense of pessimism about these countries sort of becoming depopulated and ending up with very sort of old and rural populations and no engines of growth. But it is true that some of that problem is real and is also affecting the politics of these countries. I think we have to be very careful when talking about the rule of law issues and sort of sometimes all of this gets sort of bunched into a term named populism, and we sort of distinguish between pro-democratic leaders versus populist leaders, and people sort of, I think, talk about this in a very sort of self-serving way. It strikes me as obvious, for example, that somebody like Andrej Babiš, who gets called a populist, is a very different kind of political animal and leader than, say, Viktor Orban. Andrej Babiš was prime minister for 4 years. I don't think there has been any effort at the incumbent entrenchment in the Czech Republic. I don't think there have been any major challenges to the rule of law in the Czech Republic. Hungary does stand out, in my opinion, in the sense that it has been transformed over those 12 years of the rule of Viktor Orban and Fidesz into essentially a one-party state, in which it is very difficult for the opposition to compete on a level playing field, where media ownership has been concentrated in the hands of a group of people connected to the political to the Fidesz party. So Hungary does stand out, and I think it is a challenge to the EU. But again, like, taking a very sort of granular view of things is really important. I mean, Poland gets bunched together with Hungary in these discussions. To me, Poland is a very different case, which has a vibrant and competitive political scene. We'll see the election later this year, but it's very likely that Law and Justice Party will be unseated. Yes, the country is polarized, and there have been attempts at incumbent entrenchment, which have actually been met with resistance, both from political institutions and from the public at large. So I think we have to really look at it in a sort of case by case way. And more importantly, I think it's really important to distinguish between rule of law and liberal democracy understood in narrow terms, and a sort of broader package of sort of liberal and progressive causes that people see as desirable. And I'm not intrinsically opposed to all of those liberal and progressive causes, but I also understand that there are social and cultural realities on the ground in a place like Poland or Hungary that are different from those that exist in, say, Poland or the Netherlands. So when it is said that Viktor Orban is an autocrat and an illiberal leader because he's opposed to, say, mass migration or LGBTQ rights, like that just doesn't resonate with me. I mean, I think I think there are reasons to call him an autocrat, which have to do with the way he has taken over the government and made it difficult for the opposition to compete. But you can still have a democracy which is a competitive electoral democracy, which produces outcomes that progressives and sort of left liberals don't like. And I think that's the case of say Poland or some other countries. And the point about the EU is that it is precisely composed of very sort of heterogeneous and diverse countries, and you have countries that will sort of converge in a more liberal, left liberal, more progressive equilibrium than than others, and I mean, the EU has to be able to accommodate those differences rather than to sort of display this great degree of discomfort that you see with these various resolutions of the European Parliament condemning this or that socially conservative policy in Central and Eastern Europe.
Yes, instead of just going after the actual dangers to the rule of law, and of course also then not only condemning Hungary when bad stuff happens, but also in other European member states, which of course should not be so hard. If you look at, for example, in Romania, it's not a secret that in the Romanian justice system there's profound problems, but hardly ever do you read anything about that. And I mean, my own country, even Belgium has been condemned so many times for the situation in its prisons, and we're one of the oldest democracies in Europe. So I'm already quite.
I mean, it is very hard. It is very hard though, because I think like the sort of natural inkling of people in Brussels is to try to reduce politics, including rule of law questions, to simple sort of matter of like rules and technocracy and some sort of technocratic process. Whereas these questions will be inherently sort of political, and then yes, it does look like an instance of hypocrisy when one country sort of singled out for a transgression that also occurs in other countries. Like not necessarily the Commission and the Parliament are sort of involved in politics in one way or another when they sort of address these questions. It strikes me that we are sort of in the worst of all worlds, where like it's very hard for these institutions to get it right, and there is also ample space for autocrats to behave badly and still have some sort of political cover, sometimes provided by the European institutions themselves. I mean, this sort of idea of tying socially progressive causes like LGBT rights or access to abortion, etc., to questions of rule of law and functioning of the judiciary, etc., means that the sort of political coalition that is defending the independence of the judiciary or rule of law just becomes smaller as a result. Yes. Right? And that's just a very sort of bad political strategy, yet it's the one that we sort of see more often than not coming from the European parliamentarians and others.
I think that's absolutely I think very well put, and the recent scandals in the European Parliament have not exactly strengthened the EP as a, let's say, as a great moral authority. But anyway, Dalibor, I thought that was a great discussion. Thank you very much. I wish you all the very best with your intellectual endeavors. I'll follow your work with great interest, and I hope you will be able to write occasionally to find the time for Brussels Report as well. So thank you very much.
Pieter, thank you so much for having me on, and I'm always happy to work with Brussels Reports and with you in the future. So and good luck with everything you're doing.
Thank you.
The Brussels Report podcast.